Hi, and thank you for joining us for the third webinar in the National Child Protection Week series. I'm Rani Kumar. I'm the Head of Policy and Campaigns at NAPCAN, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which I am speaking to you today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of all the lands from which you are joining us today. So welcome to National Child Protection Week 2020. This year's theme, Putting Children First, recognises that this year has been a challenging year for many, and in the midst of all this, we must remember to put children first. Putting children first means valuing and celebrating all children, and the conversations we have lined up for you this week help to demonstrate the different ways we can all collectively achieve better outcomes for all children. Now, before we can get into the framing early childhood development conversation we've got for today, which I know you're all keen to get into, just some quick housekeeping notes. All webinars... sorry, I'm just being told that there might be some issues with sound. Bear with us if that's the case. I hope there's always these little quirks with new platforms that we're using for these webinars. I hope most of you can hear. Yep. So some people can hear me. Lucky you. The others that can't, I hope that it sort of catches up soon. Okay, excellent. So I was just saying, just some quick housekeeping before we can get into the conversation with Nat and Donna, which I know you're all keen to get into. The webinars will be recorded, so any glitches will be ironed out hopefully in the recording, and they'll be posted to our website in due course, hopefully within a couple of days if we can. The question function has been enabled, so please keep your questions coming through. We're really keen to hear what you're thinking and to have you participate in this conversation. If you have any technical difficulties, which clearly people are already having, we've got our team who've put their phone numbers and email addresses into the chat box. So please feel free to contact them and they'll help you resolve any issues. And if you're worried about your mute button being on, let me reassure you, this is a listen-only webinar. You are not able to turn on your camera or your audio unless we do it for you. So today's webinar is called How to Frame Early Childhood Development. Many of you may already be framing gurus or experts or converts, and some of you might be wondering, what is this framing stuff all about? So at NAPCAN, we're definitely framing converts, not experts. In recent years, we've been really interested in the power of words and the choices we make with words. And we are convinced that framing works. That is, that you can achieve better and more effective social change if we get our communication right. And in order to get our communication right, we need to do the research and listen to the evidence. Last year, we worked with the Frameworks Institute and the Parenting Research Centre to help promote the Talking About Parenting research. And that was really received by all of you across the sector, across Australia. This year, we're super excited to be able to promote another new set of evidence, this time about how we talk about early childhood development, a topic that's clearly dear to many of our hearts. Last year, we were honoured to have the biggest framer of them all, Dr Nat Kendall-Taylor, the CEO of Frameworks Institute, join us in person from the US. This year, we had to settle for the next best thing, Dr Nat Kendall-Taylor, the CEO of Frameworks Institute, joining us via webinar from the US. Many of you may have heard Nat speak before. If not, you're in for a treat. Nat has been working with NAPCAN on a separate project as well that looks at how we frame prevention as a sector in Australia. We're now kickstarting the initial stages of this project and are really keen to secure the funding to go the whole way. Hopefully we can get him back next year to talk about that project. And we're also thrilled to have Professor Donna Cross, from the Director of the Early Childhood Development and Learning Collaboration at the Telethon Kids Institute, with us today. Donna has been instrumental in changing the core story for Early Childhood Development project that we're talking about today, right from the start, and she's passionate about this work. I'm told that Donna has led more than 80 applied research projects on children's wellbeing and social and emotional development, and has been awarded $84 million in research funding since 1999. So who better to bring us information about this brand new research and the resulting resources? Can't wait to hear all about it. Over to you, Donna.
Thanks for the privilege of being part of this webinar this morning. I often have said to my colleagues, all of whom are Zoom zombies, like I'm sure all of you out there at the moment, what a privilege it is to listen to Nat. And Nat, I have to tell you, already this morning I've had a meeting with Mary and Alice, who I know are on the line, who who said, look, it's going to be great to hear you, Donna, but wow, we get Nat again, even if you are coming through our screens. So this morning's a very exciting webinar, certainly for us at CoLab. And CoLab is this amazing opportunity, a collaboration between the Telethon Kids Institute and the Minderoo Foundation to focus on how we can bring evidence into the hands of people who need it most. And as researchers and as practitioners, I think we're all challenged to communicate well to those who can make the most of the evidence that we have in our hands. So we've really struggled with that over the years, and in 2018, I was lucky enough to meet Nat in Washington, arriving 20 minutes late for a meeting because I got totally lost, but Nat was still incredibly gracious. And at that time, I talked to him about the challenges that we were having, that we had terrific information, at least we thought it was terrific, but it seemed to be falling on somewhat deaf ears. We were not able to present this content in ways that people could make meaning of it and understand it, and most importantly, act on it. So Nat and his extraordinary team have worked with us since that time to help us understand the gap between what the community thinks about these issues and what researchers would like the community to be thinking about these issues, and certainly practitioners as well. And this has been a really extraordinary experience, and I know that today Nat is going to be sharing much of those findings from our research, and also the wonderful research he's been doing with the Parenting Research Centre around how do we get one message, and I don't mean one single message, but one overall narrative that is consistent and delivered by many voices. And really that's our challenge as we go forward, because all of you, I know in the work that you're doing, are working so hard, obviously, to nurture our most precious asset, which of course is Australian children, or children generally. I shouldn't just be saying Australian children when we have the rest of the world who will benefit from this as well. And I think that the outcome of this project is quite extraordinary, because it builds on the recognition that communication is really complex, and that often our messages don't work in the way that we want them to. And organisations often, particularly in the early childhood area, have often lacked a really cohesive narrative that really collectively builds public understanding. And I really mean collectively, because if we're each giving lots of different messages, we're effectively cannibalising each other's airspace. Whereas if we could come together and work out what's the best way to communicate and use that overall narrative to present the kinds of messaging that we need, that can make an extraordinary contribution to lifting overall public understanding. And we know when we get the public on side, the public will vote about, for example, to shift government thinking around the efforts that are put into early childhood. We know that common understanding will mean that they support parents to do the best for their children. Parents understand what are the sorts of actions that they can be doing to support themselves. And of course, practitioners are in a better position to think about the ways that they communicate, even small things. I know Nat is helping us so much with just the words that we use. Here and now and in the future, kinds of concepts being an example, and I know he'll talk to those later. And our research has shown generally that the public still don't see early childhood as a priority issue. And in fact, Nat's work has shown us that the public think that early childhood is this wonderful time, whereas if we just stand back and watch and cheer, that children will do well. But we know that we need to be much more proactive, and we need to know the sorts of actions that will really ensure that children have the opportunity to thrive and strengthen in all the things that they do now, both now and into the future. And also, I think we need to shift government thinking about the ways that they address early childhood. So frameworks, as many of you know, and I know there are, forgive me for saying this, but I know I'm one, a lot of groupies on the line who know that the frameworks gives us at last a really extraordinary scientific framework to investigate what communication choices work for early childhood in Australia. And I think that's really important. You'll hear Nat's wonderful American accent, but be aware that the work he's talking about is the reason why he is starting to develop an Australian accent, because he and his team have spent so much time here working and interacting with the public around those issues. And now we have, and certainly when I say we, I mean collectively across the country, because all of the work that has been funded by Minderoo is available for free and accessible. No copyright, please use everything that we've created. A little later, I'll talk to the reports that are available on the CoLab website and other terrific resources, including an e-learning toolkit that, again, is being developed in partnership with the Frameworks Institute, so that we can tell a powerful and memorable news story that replaces the standard ways that people think about early childhood. And we hope that this core story will take this information and make it much more accessible to the public, to policymakers, and of course practitioners. And it contains all sorts of really interesting information that will change our thinking. The first three sub-reports that the Frameworks Institute have produced for us focus on mental health and the ways that we can support children's mental health from birth, the sorts of actions we can be taking, communications that we should be making around the prenatal period, in the ways that we communicate to families and again to the wider public, practitioners and policymakers, and of course also information about play. Now, these are only three issues that have come out of the Map the Gaps report, the areas where we know we need to be influencing communication. And today I know Nat is going to talk to those concepts, and particularly the concept related to equity, because we know that supporting early childhood builds health and creates fairness for Australia's children, both now and in the future. So we need to make sure that children are surrounded by what they need to thrive. We also know that when we support children's development in the early years, we increase their health and well-being and learning, and the success of our communities, both now and also into the future. So same message, many voices. That repeated exposure is what we think makes the most difference, and providing all the resources and support that we can do to deliver that. Now, as I mentioned before, we're really proud to work with NatCan and to work alongside them in the messaging that they've captured for the National Child Protection Week campaign poster this year. And you may have seen that. It's the most extraordinary poster, let alone the colour. It's designed, obviously, to support conversations about how we build communities and things that we can do that will help children to thrive. And it features a beautiful piece of artwork created by children at the C&K Kedron in Queensland, who are about 4 or 5 years of age. And they were discussing the things that they love about living in Australia, and some of the beautiful features that we have in Australia, including homes, and you'll see these featured in the artwork, electricity, family and friends and cars, and of course rainbows. And it's easy to see how much they enjoy the opportunities that they have, and it's our job to make sure that they are extraordinary. Now, speaking of extraordinary, I'd like to introduce Nat, and I know that you all know that it's Dr. Nat Kendall-Taylor, and Nat comes with the most extraordinary experience. He is an expert in psychological anthropology. Try and say that quickly. And also, obviously, communication science. But I loved Rani's introduction when she said he's the biggest framer in the world. I don't know how you feel about that, Nat, but it sounds pretty spectacular. Context will be important as we use that. Nat obviously oversees, in his role as the CEO of the Frameworks Institute, the organisation's pioneering and its solid, robust, research-based approach to strategic communications, and uses methods from the social and behavioural sciences to measure how people understand complex socio-political issues and test ways to reframe them to ultimately drive social change. Don't we need that? He leads an amazing group of multidisciplinary social scientists and communications practitioners who investigate ways to apply those innovative framing methods to social issues, and also works alongside groups like us and NatCan to train not-for-profit organisations to put these findings into practice. It's been 12 years, Nat. I noticed that you've been leading the Frameworks portfolio with special issues related to early childhood, obviously, mental health, criminal justice, and ageing. And he's led an extraordinary expansion of frameworks, and we're so lucky that that's occurred, because we're amongst the many countries where that has been expanded to, including Brazil and Canada, Germany, Kenya, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. So not only are we taking you away from your family tonight, Nat, but clearly we're taking you away from your country many times. And we're just delighted to introduce you this morning, Nat, in the work that you've done to lead this research. And we look forward to what you share with us about how to frame those ideas. Thanks, Nat.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Donna. The introductions. So Donna has given me now 2 introductions in the last week, and they have both been fantastic ways to get into a presentation on framing. So I'm very grateful for those introductions, Donna, and you do a great job of talking about framing, and have kind of picked up on a number of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about through the presentation. So I first of all just want to start and say hello to everybody who's on the line, who's on the webinar. Hopefully you can see the slide, you can see my face and hear my voice. All 3 of those things are important. And just to tell you all that I am really excited to talk you through the presentation that I've put together. I do feel a little bit bad if folks have seen a prior frameworks presentation in the last couple of weeks, because some of this content will be the same. This is really a chance to, as Donna said, pull on the really deep and extensive work that Donna and I and our teams have done with support from the Minderoo Foundation over the last 2 years, but also pull in work that we've done with PRC, pull in work that we've done for the last 8 years in Australia, and kind of put that all together with some more recent thinking that I've been doing about framing in the incredibly challenging but wildly important times that we are in. So I'm very excited about that, which means that for the next 30 minutes, at least one person on this webinar, the 493 of us, is going to have fun. I will have fun for the next 30 minutes. I make no other promises, but we can do that. I want to just take a second to acknowledge all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are on the call right now, and their elders past, present, and emerging. And to just say a couple of quick thank yous. I have not yet thanked Ronnie and the team at NatCan for inviting me to be here, and even inviting me to be here after we did this last year. I guess that means that things didn't go too horribly last year, and I would have been great to be there in person, as Ronnie said, but that is certainly not in the cards this year. Again, thank you to Donna, CoLab, her colleagues there, as well as everyone at Minderoo. And no offense to anyone else that I've thanked, but biggest thanks to all of you who are taking your very valuable time to be on this webinar here today. And I, in exchange for that very valuable time, I will do my absolute best to add some value to your work and your thinking by bringing you the work and thinking that I've been doing in Australia for the last 8 years, but in the previous 12 years altogether, which has been really focused on translating issues in the science from early childhood to make change, to make policy and practice change. So Donna told you a little bit about who I am. I'm going to do the obnoxious thing of telling you a little bit more about who I am. And don't think that that's because I suffer from some delusion of self-importance, although, you know, based on what's going on in my country right now, that would be a fairly fair stereotype of Americans. But I'm going to tell you a little bit more because it's important for the kind of work that I'm going to be telling you about. So I do a kind of anthropology. I specialize in a kind of anthropology that's called psychological anthropology. And what that means is that for the last 20 years, I've been really interested in how culture influences the way that we think, how we use culture in mind to process information, to make meaning of messages, and to formulate and reach decisions. And I do that work with about 30 other total framing geeks and dweebs who are social scientists of different disciplines. And it's really that approach, that kind of understanding the central force that culture plays in how we communicate, how we connect with people, how we move thinking, how we're able to generate support for issues, that is really at the core of the work that we do. And so we've said this word, I don't know how many times already today, probably at least 20 minutes in the first, 20 minutes that we've been on this call. And I'm going to do us all hopefully a service in providing a common foundational definition of this term that we can use for at least the remainder of this webinar, but hopefully that you can take and find helpful as you move forward. So when we talk about framing for the remainder of this webinar here today, we mean the choices in how we present information. And these, it's important to say, can be very small and seemingly insignificant choices. The pronouns that we use, do we say us and them, they, those, or do we say we, ours? And sometimes much more obvious choices and metaphors that we use to explain how things work, the values that we evoke to argue for why our issues are so important and require action. Framing is how all those choices, big and small, influence how people think, how they feel, and how they act as a result. So really simply, variations in how we present information, not just speaking, but the images we use, all those choices and how those variations have effects on how people perceive issues and how they act, perception and behavior. And I'm going to show you a quick example that comes from work that we've done in the United States that hopefully, for me, this is a really provocative example that shows how those choices, in this case, the choice that we make and how we use values frames affects people's, in this case, their support for evidence-based policies. So this is a particular piece of work that was done with an organization in the United States called the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, who has as their mission taking developmental science and translating it for policy and practice change. It's a part of their work in which we've collaborated to develop different ways of talking about child mental health. And this is one particular part of that work. It's one experiment. It's a large experiment. It's about 6,500 people. This is conducted in the United States. This is really important to say, so you could maybe have some productive distance from anything that's depressing and overwhelming that you see here, because this isn't the case. We'll talk about it in a second in Australia. But this particular experiment is testing two different values frames. That's what you see along the horizontal axis of this graph. And the way that this experiment works is that you log on to the experiment as a participant and you get randomly assigned to one of three different groups. So group one would read a message about a program, a child mental health program, and that program is framed with the value of collective progress and prosperity. The person would read something like, it's important that we do a better job of supporting, of addressing child mental health in this country because, they wouldn't say it in such a cliched way, because children are our future, right? Their solid development, mental health influences our ability to move forward as a country, our ability to have success, and to experience kind of collective well-being. Another person logs on, gets randomly assigned to the value message, which again, you see on the right-hand side of the screen, of vulnerability. So they read the same 80 words about that child mental health program, except the lead-in, the first 10, 12, 15 words is different. So instead of what you heard about collective progress and prosperity, they would read, it's important that we do a better job of supporting child mental health because children are our most vulnerable citizens. They deserve our empathy and our compassion, and we must do better by them. A third person logs on and they get assigned to the third group, which is the control condition. And in this case, they just read about the program with no frame being presented at the top of that message. And then they all 6,500 people, answer a set of outcomes questions that are designed to measure how supportive they are of, in this case, what are 15 evidence-based policies. So what you're going to see on this next clip are what and I think Donna as well thinks are two absolutely gorgeous green bars are going to appear on the screen. And what those bars are going to show you is the extent to which hearing those different values frames affects people's support for the policy. And I always like to do just a really quick kind of stats 101 lesson to level set here. Up is good and down is not so good. So you notice that value on the left-hand side of the screen, the collective progress one, is boosting, it's elevating people's support for these evidence-based policies. That's the good news. There's a little framing dance that we do. It's way too late for me to do that here, but maybe some other time. And you probably also noticed the less rosy, less good news towards the right-hand side of the screen, which is that value of vulnerability is having the opposite effect, right? So not only is it indistinguishable from zero, which is kind of no frame, but it actually depresses people's support for those policies. So to translate, if you're an expert or an advocate working on child mental health in the United States and you use the value of vulnerability to frame those messages, you not only waste your breath, you not only waste that valuable communications resources, but you use those valuable resources in a way that directly disadvantages those policies, those solutions, those proposals, those programs that you are advocating for. So the really, it gets worse. The really interesting, as a researcher, I can say that. If I was a practitioner, I would use a different word. The really interesting thing is that in a subsequent piece of analysis where we look back at all the field's external facing materials, their websites, their blogs, their press releases, their op-eds, their pamphlets, their mission statements, whatever, over a 3-year period, guess which value we found to be used in over 90% of those communications. So if we were in a room all together, that would not have that be a rhetorical question, but it must be here. It is the value of vulnerability. So we know that the field has used, in retrospect, what is a shocking amount of resource to actually disadvantage the very goals that they have as members of the field, as advocates, as researchers, as practitioners. And so I've started to use this. Those of you who have heard frameworks presentations before know that there are a lot of metaphors in them, and metaphors are clearly very important to kind of restructuring and shifting the way that people think about issues. But I've come to use and find this metaphor of a key and unlocking to be a very helpful way of thinking about framing. So framing, again, the choices that we make and how we present information, the things that we choose to highlight, the things that we choose not to highlight, plays this really powerful role in unlocking people's thinking, of opening new space for people to think about issues, of kind of creating space for people to engage with solutions and consider proposals in new ways. That's the positive, kind of optimistic sense of this metaphor. The other sense is that those choices can also lock things up. They can shut down thinking. They can kind of turn people off. They can allow them to tune out. They can polarize. They can kind of really powerfully kind of close that door to open thinking and consideration of new ideas. So what I'm going to do for the rest of our time here today is I'm going to tell you about 5 key framing ideas that I think are really important for all of us on this webinar to think about in the work that we do, and hopefully to bring into our practice as communicators. And I want to make one thing really clear from the outset. We are all communicators, right? And so when I say communicators, when I talk about these ideas, I'm not just talking to the people who have the word communication in their job title, right? I'm talking about any of us and all of us who communicate about ideas to people to try to make different things happen, right? And I would argue that that is the case for all 500 of us who are on this webinar right now. So no one gets an easy out from listening to these ideas and trying to incorporate them into our practice. So again, to set the stage here, so most of these ideas come from work that Donna and I have done in the Core Story of Early Childhood Development Project, but a number of them come from more recent thinking that I've been doing and research that Frameworks has been doing around the COVID context. So just to kind of tell you the origin of these ideas is important. So the first idea, and this is really one where, as Donna said, some of this is going to be about how we talk about equity. I think this is the front and center, a super important one, has always been important, but I think is even more important than ever now, is that we have to think really carefully about how we position the groups of children and families that we are advocating for. And it's not enough, I hate to say it, to just want to or try to do the best thing. Sometimes we can use frames and evoke ideas that have these backfire effects that end up creating understandings and patterns of thinking that actually disadvantage the folks that we are trying to work with and support. And so I'm going to show you 3 of these kind of phrases or wordings that you've seen, that I know you've seen in Australia and that we've seen big time in the United States over the last 5 to 6 months. And the first one is this idea of vulnerability, right? So this is a word that is almost like if I were someone who bet, who liked a good wager, this is one I would take, that almost any social issue communications these days has this word in it. And I think it's used for the most part with good intentions, right? But what vulnerability framing does, what this word does, is that it very powerfully otherizes the groups that we are applying that term to, right? So it immediately casts them as other, as out there as they, them, those. And in so doing, vulnerability framing kind of reifies or reinstantiates or concretizes all of these stereotypes that exist in our culture that we hold about people, and that become primed and activated when we use that vulnerability framing. It also, I should say, before I get to the next idea, vulnerability framing in activating those stereotypes doesn't just kind of activate those stereotypes among the kind of mainstream public. It actually activates those stereotypes in the groups who are being labeled as vulnerable, and changes the way that people see themselves and their identities in a really powerful and important way. So the next thing that we see a lot of in COVID times, and a lot of this you see in the United States, we see a lot of this in terms of how we're talking about older adults, but also the way that we're talking about low income or poor children and families. And so as soon as we've set up this dynamic that there are some people who are saving other people who are vulnerable or victims, we create stigma, right? This is a very powerful way to kind of position hierarchically certain groups of people and other groups of people as being less than or below. And also, anytime that you activate savior and victim framing, the only solution, the only action that we can see within this frame is one of sacrifice, right? Not collaboration, not aspiration, but suffering and sacrifice. And finally, I think the trickiest one is, and again, you see a lot of this in the way that we do a lot of work with aging advocates, the way that aging advocates frame messages about older adults and appeal to the worthiness of certain groups, right? So the classic one is also the working poor, right? It's trying to establish the worthiness of a certain group of people. And what this does really powerfully is, first of all, it establishes the fact that there are some people who are worthy and other people who are not worthy, and invites that kind of evaluation, which is a really dangerous and slippery slope, and I would say never a winning endeavor to engage in our framing. And so these are things that I think kind of fairly unequivocally we want to avoid in the way that we communicate about groups of people. And then the question, which hopefully you are asking, which I always ask, is that's great, we can stop doing those things, those are the problems, but what do we do instead? And I think there's, and I should say that these are ideas that are also existing in the public discourse. And I would say that a number of these are things that I have seen from being a slightly more than casual observer of public discourse in Australia, is that there is a way of talking about interconnection and the interdependence of society as a strength rather than as a liability. So interdependence can make you stronger in terms of this frame that we're going for, instead of people's interdependence on other people bringing people down. So this is a really important, seemingly subtle but powerful way of reframing this conversation. Instead of talking about some people needing to sacrifice for other people, we can evoke a common responsibility, a collective responsibility frame in which we are all responsible to all people in a society. We can connect with people's common experiences instead of talking about how different people are, you know, they and them, those experiences over there. We can evoke common experiences as a way to allow people to identify and see some common humanity in groups that are so frequently framed as being other and over there. And we can be really clear that the answer is for everyone to step up and do the right thing rather than appealing to sacrifice and saving. So the second idea that's really important, and also one that I wish I could kind of dial up or dial in terms of the discourse that we see, especially around COVID, but I think this is endemic. This goes back prior to March, is finding a better balance between the way that we emphasize the urgency, the problem of the problem, and the efficacy, the idea that there are things that we can do that would fix, remediate, solve, address a problem. And so in work that we've done, but that a lot of other people have done in the field of social psychology, there's these really interesting findings that when messages are all about urgency, right? So data about problem, story about problem, example of problem, more data about problem, another story about the problem, is that people very quickly reach what has been called crisis fatigue or emergency inflation, right? We know that there's a big, bad pile of dire social problems. And if you frame yours as one of those, all people do is they put it on the stack and then they move on, right? That you evoke a very strong sense of fatalism, which leads in short order to people's willingness, eagerness to disengage with whatever information you have just framed as being so dire and on fire. Unfortunately, you can't just flip the script and go hopey-changey, solutions abound, rainbows, unicorns, lollipops, rivers of cotton candy are everywhere. Because when you do that, especially in a time where for many people that's not the case, people will outright reject your message. And even if they don't outright reject your message, messages that lack the grip of urgency lack the motivational component that urgency brings to a conversation. So the answer, like most other things, is one of balance, right? So you want to have a robust sense of urgency that you are advancing, but you also, through your tone, through your examples, through your data, want to make it very clear that there are solutions to the problem. And if we implement those solutions, better outcomes, different outcomes will result. So when you achieve this balance, there's the perception of agency, of efficacy. People engage with an issue and are willing to be persuaded and moved to action. So one of the best examples of this comes from some work that we've done on issues of child protection, unfortunately not in Australia, but in the UK. So in the UK work, we were interested in the question of, could we come up with frames that move people to support policy solutions that got people to attribute responsibility more to kind of systems and policies and away from horrible individuals, that led people to a sense that there were things that could be done, and that engaged people in some behavioral intentions. Would you donate? Would you volunteer? Would you write a letter? Would you participate in a civic activity that is related to the solution? And we found that in this work, appealing to the value of social responsibility, right, that we have a public responsibility to prevent and attend to issues around child protection, to issues of child abuse and neglect, we were able to see some positive movements. Again, these are up, not down. These are beautiful blue bars rather than gorgeous green bars, but the idea is the same. We saw some positive movement. So then we took this positive movement and we did to this message what most child protection advocates in the UK do, which is two things. So data about the extent of the problem. I don't know what the data is, 1 in every 8 children will experience X, Y, or Z by the time they're age A, B, C. And a short story that illustrates kind of how horrible the problem is. And when we did that, so this is urgency, right? This is a really strong dose of urgency. All that good effect gets completely sapped. It goes away and has no statistical difference from people who receive no message. So this is not good news. And this is largely what for a long time, at least in the UK, had been going on. So then we weren't just happy with seeing what happened when we dosed urgency. We wanted to see if we could counteract that. And the way that we did that is that we inserted, I think, 2 sentences at the end of this message that talked about a particular program, a particular solution in the UK, which is called Childline. The name says it all. And we put that into the message. And when we did, we found not only were we able to kind of neutralize or balance some of that problem statement, but we achieved the most powerful message through this combination of a collectivizing value, a sense of urgency, but a strong sense, in this case, a specific example of a solution. So what to do here is to don't be afraid to bring a solution to the conversation. It's not enough just to bring a solution and drop it. You need to explain how it works, how doing this thing leads to these better outcomes. Tone matters incredibly when it comes to balancing urgency and efficacy. You all know the way that messages are so frequently toned, whether it's visual toning or the words that we use, that presents this overwhelming weight of the problem. And what we need to do instead is to communicate through our tone, a more aspirational tone, a more inspirational tone, that there are solutions and not just problems. But it is really important to emphasize that we cannot leave the tension or the bad guy out of this story, right? Urgency is an essential and important part of this equation. And if you do not have urgency, if you do not connect with the problem in your messages these days, people will be very quick to reject and to dismiss what it is you have to say. The third idea, this is one that comes really directly. All of these, the first two have been tested in the core story work. This is one that comes really centrally out of that work, is to use the value of fairness between places as your call to action, as your reason why greater attention needs to be paid to an issue, greater support for solutions needs to be had and maintained. So what do I mean by fairness between places? I mean, moving from a message like this, I won't ask you to read the whole thing. I conveniently have some of this highlighted where the value, so values are the part of our communications that answer the question of why something matters. And so when you read this message right here and you ask, why did this matter? It matters for two things. It matters because, you know, in a very circular way, early childhood development matters because early childhood development is critical. It's kind of an unproductively circular value. Or the only other answer that you can come up with is science, kind of science says. And I will just tell you now, we have run a number of experiments over the last 12 years that I've been at Frameworks that has tested the value of science says, and never once have we found it to be whatsoever productive in moving people to engage and support solutions. So fairness between places is about moving from something that looks like this on the left-hand side of the screen to something that looks like this on the right-hand side of the screen. So again, I'll highlight here the part of this message, which is really driving, dosing, evoking, priming, cueing this value of fairness between places, that every child should have the opportunity to be healthy and well, no matter where they're born or grow up. And that right now, this is, again, you can see some of this urgency and efficacy. Right now, this isn't true. There's children living in different parts of the country who have dramatically different chances to experience positive development. So this is what hitting this value looks like in your communications. And just to give you a sense of the power that evoking this value can have, we in another one of these, I have no idea what color these are. I think these are like maybe gray bars that are about to appear. And what they're going to show you is the way that three different values that we tested: fairness across places, which I've just explained; human potential, which is the idea that, you know, we need to support development to allow each and every child to realize his or her full potential; or future savings, which is kind of the kind of more policy relevant idea that we need to invest now in order to reap benefits or experience largely fiscal but also social savings later. And when you test these values and measure them against how they affect people's willingness to invest more public resources to support children and families, you see this clear finding, whereas the fairness across places value is boosting support for supporting kids and families, whereas the other two are having statistically insignificant effects. So what this means in your communications is that instead of leading with things are not fair between groups, you need to lead with things are not fair between places. And I want to just pause here for a second to manage a way that this could be interpreted, which is not how it should be interpreted. So this does not mean that you can't talk about fairness or unfairness between groups of people. You have to. It exists, it needs to be addressed, it needs to be part of your communications. What this says is a comment about ordering, is that leading with those frames that immediately and strongly go to the unfairness between groups of people is a less productive way of unlocking a conversation than leading with fairness between places, right? So lead with fairness between places, get through that door, and on the other side of that door, you can have rich and robust and effective conversations about equity between groups or inequity between groups. It also means that we need to talk about how, instead of how our interventions affect executive function outcomes, kind of smaller developmental outcomes, we need to talk about how our interventions affect fairness, either increasing fairness, the interventions that we want to see, or impairing fairness, creating unfairness, the interventions that we do not want to see or the things that we want to move from. The fourth recommendation is one that Donna referenced, and I think this is one of these ones that I fear seems so simple, but it's frequently these simple, subtle framing changes that have these incredibly powerful effects on the way that people engage with our information, support our ideas, and come with us into conversations. And this is, to me, this is one of these, and it's really powerful. So we need to make our issues about not just later, not just how, in the kind of Heckmanian argument, right? A dollar invested here saves $7 in problems averted later, right? We need to, that kind of framing has some power, but what we found in this work, and I'll talk about in a second, is that we also need to talk about the way that that our programs, that our ideas, that our solutions, that our work has effects now, right now, in the lives of children and families. And so what this means, and we found this again in the work with Donna, and we've since really been exploring this in some of our COVID work in the United States, is that if we talk about children and child development or child protection, always in the sense of this instrumental future, that the things that we do now are important so that we realize some benefit later. It's very easy, and we have great, if we had the ability to show you video data, I'd show you some focus group data, which is really powerful in illustrating this, is that people have a problem with the instrumental frame and the always future frame. People think that kids right now matters. Australians think that kids matter. And they're relatively quick and suspicious when they think that you are monetizing the well-being of children. The right now, so right now only frame does lack some of the gravity and the kind of policy play and connections that this future frame has. But we found that there's a fairly easy way of combining these two frames into now and later frames in a way that talks about the importance of the things that we are doing for children and families now in their lives right now today, but also explaining the effects that accrue kind of down the line and further out in time. And the reason is that these kind of frames really tap into the value that people ascribe to children, but also get in some of this kind of gravity of the persistence of the effects that kind of cascade from early experiences. And I've said this already, but I have to show you this slide because it took me about 5 minutes to make this next build happen, is that in both quantitative and qualitative research, which you can find detailed in the reports that Donna referenced and that she'll talk about in a second, we found overwhelmingly that the now or the later frames underperformed consistently these combined or aggregated frames. And so what that looks like is moving from this message that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, which I think is really pretty typical. This is an actual piece of advocacy communications that I have hopefully anonymized in ways that protect its purveyors. But you can see here really strongly that the frame that's being evoked here is this kind of classic developmental kind of instrumental later frame. And what it means is moving from this to what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which clearly establishes the fact that these are issues that matter now, but that they also have this cascade or this down the line effect. And I would say that these are the kinds of messages that people who are really good at writing messages, which is not me, can bring to life and do much more effectively than I've done on the right-hand side of the screen here. But this is really just some prose, some text to show you, to kind of model, to show you what it is I'm talking about. And so what this means is that instead of always down the line, is that we have to evoke frames in which we discuss both the current and future importance of child well-being, of child development, of child health. And instead of always being instrumental, instead of always talking in those terms of $1 here for 7 later, it's okay to be more intrinsic. It's okay to talk about the value of childhood and not just see childhood as something that you invest in, not just to talk about ROI, return on investment. The fifth, and we're almost to the end here, is less of a research recommendation and more of I don't know, more of a mission that I am on to make sure that we are doing the right things in the time that we are in. So even a quick cursory look back at history shows that the ways that issues are communicated in times of social kind of chaos, like the one we are in, are critical in establishing how issues are understood and how actions are pursued and how solutions are supported and created in the future. So you can look at, in the United States, the Great Depression, and coming out of the Great Depression, how there was, based on the ways that people communicated about issues, there were some pretty big shifts in this country in terms of the way that people thought and understood the role of government and intervention in some ways that I think, and I think most people would agree, were really positive. On the other hand, if you look, and these are both American examples, I realize that if you look at 9/11 and the kind of framing that occurred in 9/11, you can see a much less positive view of how that period of flux led to the powerful othering, to racism, to Islamophobia, and other things that are unfortunate and that we are still bearing the brunt of today. So I want to argue here that the times that we are in right now are incredibly important to get right for now, right? The decisions that we make and how we talk about public health and how we talk about child protection affect kids and families and the people who we work with and collaborate with right now in this moment. But the choices that we make and how we frame our information are also incredibly consequential for the ensuing understandings that we emerge from this time of chaos with. And I think that Ronnie mentioned this project at the beginning. I think that the idea of prevention is one of these ideas that is in considerable flux right now. And how we talk about prevention, those choices big and small, will influence how people coming out of this time understand this issue. And so I just want to, and Donna will do this, but to throw way too many words and letters up on a screen, I want to tell you that the CoLab frameworks research that I've pulled on most heavily throughout this presentation is available at the two websites that you see on the screen right now, and hopefully maybe someone who has better technological skills than I can put these into a chat screen so that people can access these. But before I hand it back to Donna, I just very quickly want to end with my kind of new favorite, somewhat inspirational quote about framing. Which comes from an American guy named Charles Eisenstein, who said, "The world as we know it is built on a story. To be a change agent is first to disrupt the existing story of the world, and second, to tell a new story of the world so that people have a place to go." And with that, I will say thank you. I will do my best to hand it back to my wonderful colleague, Donna. I think I've just done that. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Nat. And again, what an extraordinary presentation. I think all of us are working so hard to make sure that the language we use is appropriate. And I'm still in the very early practice stage. I still have an L on my back as I think really carefully, not just about the way we communicate, but the words that we use. And I think Nat gave us such an extraordinary insight into that. And those 5 messages that he talked to have really helped us to try and translate the evidence that we have and communicate it in a way that's really important. So when we think about evidence-based communications, it's not just having the evidence that we know is important for early childhood, but also the evidence about how to communicate this well. So if you were inspired, as I'm sure you were, by Nat, even on Labor Day evening in the United States, thank you so much again, Nat. You can go to our website, the location that Nat just provided on his screen then, and there are a whole series of reports. First are the Map the Gaps report, which really gives us an overall sense of the early years issues that have been determined in partnership with 15 other organisations who have had input into the issues that we should be addressing. And there's a report there called Guide for Communicators, talking about early childhood development in Australia, and again, some terrific information. And as I mentioned before, the series of reports related to mental health, prenatal development, and of course, play. and just the background research so that you have an understanding of the quantum of work that's gone into nearly 2 years of research to put these reports together. And now I know I need to hand over very quickly for questions in the last 5 minutes that we've got, but to be aware that we have a toolkit that's being put together in an e-learning series of modules in really fun and accessible ways to help you to help get your communications framed as strongly as you can in the work that you do going forward. So think about this as a capacity building tool. It is almost ready, and if you want to be sure that you get this, please register on the CoLab website. Of course, it's free, and even if you can't remember CoLab, if you can remember Course Story, and if you search under Course Story, Mr. and Mrs. Google will give you a direct access to that website, and it's a really quick guide, and it will help you get your L on your back and hopefully move to a P as you familiarise yourself with those frames and the recommendations that are associated with that. And we'll be launching that toolkit really soon, and we'll make you aware of any information if you register with us. And to just close, hi Warani, I'll be just a minute. I just want to mention that we've been using these Course Story messages not only in the ways that we speak about early childhood, but also in the tools that we've developed as part of CoLab. And some of you might be aware of the Bright Tomorrows parent app, a fabulous way of taking content from our research, putting it into really simple, accessible web-based or app-based information, thousands of tips and ideas of everyday moments that parents can use to help support their children's development and also for practitioners. So please watch out for the Bright Tomorrows app and much of the other work that we've been doing in CoLab, which has been translating the science that Nat has talked through this morning. There you go, Rani. I did it in less than 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Donna. No, that was fantastic. And I think we've got so many interested attendees still online that if we go a few minutes over, we might be okay. Thanks so much for such a great conversation there, Nat, so much to learn from. Donna, I just wanted to say on your Bright Tomorrows app, I've got a under 2-year-old, like a 19-month-old and a 4-year-old, and I've been using it, and I love that for a nerd like me there's also like a fact check of why this advice has been given, what's the actual science behind it. So thank you for that. And one of the questions that has been persistently coming up through this session has been, how do we access this information? How do we get going with this? So you answered a lot of that in terms of where people can access the research and the materials and resources that you're pulling together. One other thing, Donna, that you had mentioned that I just want to share quickly is the poster that we've collaborated with CoLab on producing, that is in the frame, that is bright and colourful, as Donna said, with some great artwork contributed by children from Queensland. That's available on the NatCan website and on the Telethon Kids website, so you can download that if you like. So I will try and get to at least 1 or 2 questions, and we might go a little bit over, so sorry for those people who really do need to hop off at 11:30, but if you can stay with us, we might go a little bit over, and those of you who need to hop off, this will be recorded so you can watch it later. Nat, I guess one of the really key things is that you did mention that words and frames impact how people understand and engage with issues, and how you talk about an issue really opens up new ways for people to consider information and proposals. One of the questions, I guess, is where have you seen this work? Like, what's an example of a frameworks project where you've seen the results of change in policy or practice based on utilising a new frame?
So, I mean, not to keep going on early childhood, but I think that early childhood, our work on early childhood in the United States is a really interesting example where we've seen that happen. So some of the early work, which has been in play kind of in the discourse now for almost 15 years, metaphors like brain architecture, toxic stress, serve and return, have really, I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't sound horribly immodest, but those research-based metaphors have shifted and changed the ways that members of the general public in the United States think about kids, how they work, and what we need to do to better support their health and well-being. And we've seen that kind of come out of the mouths of advocates and experts. We've seen that get taken up in the public discourse when we see issues of early childhood being debated. We've seen that kind of change the way that the understandings that people have, normal people who don't work in the science of early childhood. We've seen that make its way into policy. Those specific metaphors being in major pieces of both federal and state legislation, but also when those words aren't there, issues of early childhood 10 to 15, 20 years ago were always the first to go when things became tight, right? When there was a chopping block and things needed to be cut, it was always kid stuff. And now, even in the most conservative US states, policymakers can't do that. And they can't do that because their constituents who vote them into office would not vote them back into office if they did that. So, I mean, I think again, I'm making something that has been inordinately complex and involved tons of people, really simple and kind of artificially simple. But you can really trace the course of frames coming out of the lab into public discourse, changing public understanding, influencing policy, and now kind of working as this really stiff and hard backstop against policies being rolled back, even in, I'm not going to get too political, even in administrations like we have right now in the United States. There's a whole bunch of social issues that I have worked on that I'm sorry to say have rolled back. But I'm pleased to say that when it comes to kids, there's been much less of that rollback. I think because there is this backstop, this pressure that policymakers can feel from members of the general public.
Thank you. No, that's a really solid example, because obviously in Australia as well, a lot of that language has definitely permeated the discussions here. The brain architecture, toxic stress, it's things that are familiar with, I'm sure, all those that are with us today watching online. One other quick question I'm just going to squeeze in here for you, Nat, is I guess a curiosity about the fields of public relations, marketing, advertising, and the role they have in this, because what we find even at NatCan and when we're engaging with an agency, they're often keen to use particular frames around vulnerability or sympathy in particular. And is there work that you're doing, or is that part of how you disseminate this research to bring those sectors along?
That's a really, you're going to hate this, Ronnie. It's a really complicated question that probably warrants a really long and complicated answer. I'm not going to do that. I'll just make a couple of points, and hopefully none of them sound defensive or snarky or in any way. But there's lots that people who work on social issues can learn from people who sell products. I mean, there certainly is. I mean, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, the kinds of messages and the kinds of methods that we use to get people to buy toothpaste or, sign up for a checking account or even vote for a political candidate are really different than the kinds of methods and the kinds of communications that do that unlocking, right? That get people to be open and think about issues in new ways. And that instead of kind of influencing what are called point of purchase decisions, do I buy, not buy, vote or not vote, really start to move people's thinking about issues in a long and durable way. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from people who work on marketing and kind of on a product-based way, but I think it's also really important, like anything else, the outcome that you're going for is really important in terms of measuring what works and what doesn't work. So we're not, I have a feeling that most of the 361 people who are still on this call are not interested in selling products, right? They're interested in changing, again, this sounds hokey, changing hearts and minds. And it's important to realize that the kinds of things that we use to change hearts and minds are categorically different, frequently kind of orthogonal or contradictory to the kinds of things that we would use to sell products. And I think fear is one of those things that works in really different ways. You can make people afraid and get them to vote for somebody, as we're seeing right now. You can make people afraid and get them to kind of make a point of purchase decision. But when it comes to doing that unlocking, fear is actually a really unproductive, counterproductive even way of getting people to engage with ideas and come along with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, because I think that's what the person who's asking this question was, I suppose, trying to get a grasp of in terms of how do you actually engage with those sectors or try and pull together the threads of what you're trying to do in terms of social change versus advertising and marketing from that other more traditional angle. So thank you so much for that. I think we do have some other really great questions, but we might just want to reply to them in our post-webinar wrap up, and we'll get back to you all in via an email. I think Donna and Nat, you did an amazing job getting through a lot of content there, and we have learned a lot on this particular webinar in particular. I want to extend my sincerest thanks to you for your time and sharing this exciting new research with us all. I'm sure everyone that's online has gained a lot of ideas and new perspectives about choosing our words wisely and how to promote early childhood development. And everyone, you know, that has been asking about how do we get going with this, that's a really great sign of how many people might be downloading these resources and coming back to you for guidance on implementing. So thanks you all for joining us online and supporting National Child Protection Week webinar series. There are still a number of webinars remaining, particularly the one this afternoon might be of interest to you, which is about early childhood education and care and the policy response and the systems response we need in Australia to progress this issue. So please do join in for more conversations. We will send a copy of this recorded webinar and the key learnings and responses to questions we didn't manage to get to today within a few weeks to you via email. There's a short survey that will pop up as you exit the webinar, so we really value your feedback. Please give us your thoughts, and we really appreciate the time you take to complete it. So thanks again, and bye for now, and bye Nat and Donna. Thank you both for your time. Thank you.
Brahman, everybody. Bye-bye.